Welcome to Hillsdale College. My name is Tim Kaspar. I work at Hillsdale College, where I have for the past, 21 plus years now. During that time, I've been fortunate to have a ringside seat as the college has been growing and improving and extending its nationwide reach. And all the while, we're guided by the same mission the college has always been guided by since its founding in 1844. By the way, for those of you who are as bad at math as I am, that means the college is 177 years old this year. Here on campus, the quality of the students and faculty is better than ever. I'm sure I wouldn't make the cut. Off campus, more Americans learn from Hillsdale College than ever before. Well, we go about our work every day here on campus under the direction and leadership of our next speaker. He's been the pilot of the Hillsdale College ship since 2000. He received his BA from Arkansas State University and his MA and PhD in government from the Claremont Graduate School. He also studied at the London School of Economics and at Worcester College, Oxford University, where he served as director of research for the late Sir Martin Gilbert, the official biographer of Winston Churchill. Prior to his appointment as president of Hillsdale College, he served for 15 years as president of the Claremont Institute for the study of statesmanship and political philosophy. In 2012, due to Martin Gilbert's declining health, he assumed responsibility for editing the final 6 document volumes of the Churchill biography, and he saw the project through to completion in 2019. The biography, all 31 volumes, is available from Hillsdale College Press. In 2015, he received the Bradley Prize from the Bradley Foundation, and he's the author of a growing number of books, including most recently Churchill's Trial, Winston Churchill, and the Salvation of Free Government. The part of his job that I think he enjoys the most is teaching. He teaches a variety of courses on subjects including Aristotle, the Constitution, C.S. Lewis, and totalitarian novels. Would you please welcome an author, an editor, and professor of history and politics. He's the 12th president of Hillsdale College, Larry Piarn.
I just found out we have a green room back there. Nobody tells me anything. Welcome to the campus. I'm sorry to say that the current Secretary of State is not able to make it. So we have this other guy. I know. How many people saw my granddaughter in the dining room, right? And I know you really came for that, but there is this other guy. I'm just going to give you a short report on the state of the college. I can summarize it in this. My worthless son-in-law, who is, however, the father of that beautiful granddaughter, he told me coming out of homecoming, we won our homecoming game, and homecoming here is more fun than a barrel of monkeys. And he's walking behind, and there's these 2 undergraduates. He doesn't know them. And one says to the other, "Is homecoming this much fun at a normal college?" It tells you what we think about ourselves. Our speaker is the immediate past Secretary of State. He was a congressman from Kansas. He was a cavalry officer. That means a tank commander. He went to West Point. He graduated top of his class. There are famous generals, especially George Pickett of the Pickett's Charge at the Battle of Gettysburg, who graduated last in their class. I always thought that must be more honorable than first in his class, but the secretary graduated first. He went to Harvard Law School, where he was on the law review. He graduated first in his class. It's funny, you know, he doesn't seem that smart. Yeah, he does. Yeah, he does. He is an extremely important man because in these trials that we're going through, somebody who's serious and a fighter and has experience. Turns out there's a lot of things going wrong in America, and they emanate from Washington, D.C. Our speaker tonight's been in the middle of all that. He was in the Congress. When Donald Trump was elected, he was appointed head of the CIA. And he gives, you can ask him about it in the Q&A, he gives good reports of the spirit of most everybody there. And then he went to a different kind of place, the United States Department of State. And that's a mess. But experience with that, because it's the archetype of the mess, right? They don't work for us anymore back there. And that shouldn't even be a controversial thing to say, because the form of government does not tie them to our will anymore. And the form that we have today was deliberately chosen in things that are copious, in moves that are copiously recorded, because it had that feature that experts would rule in the name of their expertise. This man has been in the belly of that beast. Now, sometime along about 2014, I met him because Tom Cotton, Senator Cotton, also from Arkansas and therefore my cousin, I heard the secretary say tonight that he's from Kansas and he's got 200 cousins in Kansas. They're not sufficiently inbred. Tom Cotton's wife, Anna, whom my wife and I introduced Tom Cotton to, turns out it's the weirdest thing in the world. She's a Green Bay Packers fan. And the Packers were... Yeah, they won the other night, didn't they? And the Packers were playing in the playoffs, and Tom Cotton called me up and invited himself over to a little house we own in Washington, D.C. We don't own a house in Hillsdale, Michigan. As my wife says, we live above the shop. So it's a nice shop, but it's not ours. I'm coming over to watch the Packers, and I'm bringing Pompeo. And so Mike Pompeo and his wife, Susan, and Anna Cotton, and I, and my wife, Penny, we watched all afternoon a playoff game that fortunately the Packers won, or it would have been miserable. And I saw what kind of fella he is. He commanded Abrams tanks on the edge of the Soviet Union before it collapsed. What that does to a person, in my experience, is it turns them into sort of like jocks. Their humor is assertive and good, too, and makes them servants, because, they have to foreshadow their death any day. What if the Soviets come across the border? He was close to that border for a long time. I told him today, I'm very fond of him. I think he's a portentous man for the future of the country, whatever the service he does will be. But I told him today, my favorite Greek word, it turns out, I just love the way it sounds, is spoudios. Doesn't that sound great? Don't you like that word? And what it means is a person of serious moral worth. And when a person like that gets experience in the highest places, they're in a position to do better next time, and they did well the first time. And only that preparation combined with continuity can rescue this situation. And so I introduce to you an important man, Mike Pompeo.
Thank you. Lovely introduction. Thanks, everyone. Thank you. I was saying to Dr. Arndt, that much applause before you speak is dangerous. Dr. Arndt, thank you for that kind introduction. He told me that Greek word. I had no idea what it meant, so he was right. I'm not as smart as you might think. So I have a number of things I want to share with you, things that are on my heart tonight, things we can have a conversation about when I take some questions at the end. I'm privileged. I'm now out of the administration, so you'll get a chance to get Mike Pompeo unplugged. My wife would always joke in the administration, she'd say, Mike, you go on the Sunday shows and you don't smile. I'd say, honey, we're talking about really dangerous, tough things. Now I can smile. It's been a long 8 months. And I want to talk about some of those things, not because it's been impactful to me personally, but because of so much what's happened in these 8 months has impacted every one of you and every American. I was walking over here tonight. We walked from the president's office over to his home and then over here. I know this place a little bit, Hillsdale. I know its greatness, its importance to America. It's a place that imparts character. It's a place that imparts faith and freedom. It sparks memories for me of another great institution, the place that I went to school, the United States Military Academy at West Point. It feels in some ways as they serve these important missions together alongside of each other. That one was founded in 1802, this one in 1844, and they have deep roots in American history. Dr. Arndt was joking about I was a good student, and most of the generals that you know who led America's charges weren't. I was deeply mindful of that. As a cadet there was just a single standard for excellence from my perspective. It was a general of the Army, Douglas MacArthur. I lived in MacArthur Barracks for a short time. He said, quote, that history fails to record a single precedent in which nations subject to moral decay have not passed into political and economic decline, leading to ultimate national disaster. For he believed only that a spiritual awakening could overcome the danger. You all know this. History leaves its marks. Dr. Arndt was talking a little bit earlier about history. The crisis of the 3rd century brought the Roman Empire to the edge of collapse due to military overextension, immigration without a civilization, plague, inflation, political disunity, and insurgents. Think about those. But our country's principles remain intact, for their instigation reaches past this world and indeed comes from another. But for the tree of liberty to have roots, America must be defended against enemies, both foreign and domestic. I spent the last 4 years working diligently to try and do that. And the question for us tonight is, will it? Will we? We're in our 3rd century now, and it must not signify our descent. The world is depending on it. To prevail, we must inscribe faith in a higher power, allegiance to America's founding documents, and a commitment to American exceptionalism. I'll talk about how we tried to do that. I want to speak tonight about 4 issues that we confronted, and they touch deeply on our present moment as well. First, the erosion of our foundational principles. You all are teaching this to the next generation here, how to make sure that that doesn't continue to erode. Second, the left's progressive domination of our central institutions. Third, I want to talk about the threat that is imposed upon us all today from the Chinese Communist Party. It is not disconnected from the first 2. And then finally, I want to talk about the things that we can all do, each of us can do, to avert this disaster. Look, you all know this. The families will always be the irreplaceable unit of humankind. Period, full stop. The expression of faith anchors families through prayer and love. America's churches, its synagogues, its mosques, and temples provide moral and physical sustenance to families in need. And character. that which you are trying to instill in students here at Hillsdale, is the essence of the United States of America. The proclamation by men and women of faith that God's relationship was with the individual and not the collective is at the center of this. It is absolutely essential. I saw this as Secretary of State. We have to marshal our authority to reach past our broken media and corrupt elites to return America to its moral core. It reminds me, my son, who's a little bit older, called me and said he'd seen the Washington Post had written a piece, and it had said, America's worst Secretary of State ever. That had followed on a piece in the New York Times just the day before said the same thing. These were not disconnected. They were aiming for me. And so my son, knowing I'm pretty tough, the first one goes by. The second one, he says, I should call and check in with Dad. So I always try to take calls from my son, and he says, Dad, did you see the Post today? And I said, I saw it. And he said, look, because I was doing some research, and there's a fellow named Elihu Washburn. And I said, yes. And he said, he was the Secretary of State for only 11 days. Surely you're better than him. Yeah. So we started a club called We're Number 2. Our children, our families are what guide us. In traversing all of the challenges we face today, look at the digital landscape, what our kids are suffering from. It is addictive. Cyber immersion, technology-induced isolation, like we've not seen in the United States before. And it was an isolation which the pandemic was amplified. The threat posed by this loneliness, this separation from family, and the constriction of perspectives has to be addressed. Look, algorithms, computers. I was an engineer by training. Algorithms, computers, social media cannot substitute for faith and family. We have to stay connected to that. Tremendous achievements have been made possible through this technology. It's great, but it can never replace a parent comforting a sick child or a person of faith holding the hand of someone in dire need. When I was a student living in Massachusetts, I had the opportunity to tutor 2 young kids who were from a pretty tough neighborhood. I taught them that arithmetic mattered. It mattered not only in the numbers, but the discipline that it would be required for them to master the subject that was in front of them. But I knew, too, it would be a gateway for them. But I knew this. I knew our time together mattered even more. Neither of these children had a father. That time with an adult was scarce for them, and I suspect it was irreplaceable. We each, all of us here, must proclaim the eternal relevance of strong families. I spent 4 years serving as America's Secretary of State. I get asked, what's the biggest challenge facing the United States and the expectations? I'll say Vladimir Putin, Chairman Kim, Xi Jinping, all big challenges. The single biggest risk to the United States of America is in our schools and in our families. Our government should never promote policies that disrupt this ideal. But we have lots of programs today, you all know them, that disparage the value of fathers. And this has to end. It has to end for the children, it has to end for the fathers, but it has to end for our country too. We must never tolerate that which is affront to the basic system, the basis of all humanity. Look, when the current Secretary of Health and Human Services testified before the Senate, he couldn't bring himself to say the word mother. Go look at the tape. We're in danger of no longer living in a country, but an asylum. When you hear language like this, faith venerates mothers as the bringers of life. But he couldn't bring himself to say it, under oath. I don't know what he called his mom. We know these people. These are the people that generate American history. Church and state are something that the left has tried to separate. In our administration, we tried never to let that happen. Our nation suffers for too much for having taken the concept of separation from church and state to mean that we have to tear the two apart. But of course, the two statements aren't synonymous. I'll never forget, I was the CIA director. I climbed off a plane in a pretty dark place, climbed down the stairs. It was 3 a.m, and a fellow presses into the palm of my hand a small pocket Bible. I was in a hurry. I hopped into my vehicle, and I opened the Bible, and he said to me, Mr. Director, you have been a light in my life. I don't tell that story about me, but because it gets to the central thesis of refusing to separate one's own personal faith and one's commitment to America and our Constitution. They're deeply intertwined. Thomas Jefferson wrote that the Almighty God hath created the mind free. And then later, he stated that the Establishment Clause, which forbade the inauguration of a state religion, but built a wall of separation between the church and state. But he knew better. It was misunderstood. It was interpreted by our courts, I think, intentionally, because the wall's purpose was to protect the expression of religion and its infringements from government. We, in our arrogance, have banished religion from our schools and public spaces, and in doing so have wrought enormous havoc. We've forgotten our founders' intent and done great harm to the republic as a result of it. John Adams had it right in his inaugural address. He said simply, patronize every rational effort to encourage every institution for propagating knowledge, virtue, and religion among all classes as the only means of preserving our Constitution. Later in that same address, he stated that he considered a respect to Christianity among the best recommendations for public service. And to that I say amen. It kept me going during my 4 years as well. And I must say, I gave a speech. It was in Cairo, Egypt. The opening line of this speech, which my speechwriters tried to take out, not once, not twice, but 3 times, I simply said that I am an evangelical Christian, standing there in Cairo. I must say that I hear about those remarks more than any other from leaders of every faith who said, we appreciated you saying that. It showed candor, it showed discipline, it showed a true commitment to something beyond one's self. And we value that. Although our faith is different, we value that too. This gets back to what Thomas Jefferson was talking about when he came to an understanding of faith and America and the importance of keeping it in our public sphere. Look, it was never the intent, nor could it have been, at the time of our nation's creation, for in that age, humanity and its progress were viewed as inseparable from our Judeo-Christian heritage and our belief in God. Our government must never be permitted to cloak God's word. Yet a powerful assemblage of elites disparages it every day. You saw them close bars and leave churches open. You know, I first had the chance to think about this idea of separating church and state when I was traveling from Washington while I was still in law school. I recall the moment I was doing a little bit of a history tour with a friend, and we were outside the Capitol at the eastern pediment of the Supreme Court, just around the corner from the Capitol building. It's not usually seen because visitors don't come in that way. It's at the tail end of Capitol Hill. The pediment's frieze depicts history's lawgivers. Seated centrally, Moses holds the 2 famous massive tablets, and they're blank in this particular rendition. I couldn't figure out exactly why there were no words. I thought about it, and then I did some reading. I came to understand that it was because the 10 Commandments differ in their wording and in their order from the Protestant, Roman Catholic, Orthodox, and Jewish faiths. Therefore, if the words of the commandments had been carved into the stone, or so the craftsmen believed, America's temple to justice would show a preference for one faith as amongst the others. He knew that wasn't its place. And so, desiring that the religious wars of Europe would not find refuge in America, our founders forbade just that preference in the establishment of a state religion. But make no mistake about it, the wisdom of the Eastern pediment continues. There's another meaning. The essence of this idea of church and state and its separation here in our nation was to make sure that there was no deification of the state. It is not our God. We have bigger callings. The truth was first enunciated by Jesus Christ. Render therefore to Caesar that things that which are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Note that he did not say that certain human activities were outside of God's authority. No, he proclaimed the divine and the physical spheres of humankind to be together. It means to live within both in our earthly constraints and still obey the Father. Our founders knew this. When I came to the State Department, our human rights doctrine was a mess. We had diplomats across the world talking about human rights that I was deeply unfamiliar with from my study of our Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and America's history. And so I sought to do my best to corral it. We created something we called the Commission on Unalienable Rights. It was chaired by a woman named Mary Ann Glendon, who'd been a former ambassador to the Vatican and is a teacher at Harvard Law School. I asked her to chair this commission. And the idea was to reground American foreign policy and our human rights in the American tradition. I was sued by over 300 organizations within 24 hours of the announcement. Yes, and then several hundred more times. I wanted to take us back to the tradition that Hillsdale College teaches its students and the importance of understanding that as we dealt with our friends and our adversaries around the world. I wanted to speak about these fundamental rights. We know them from our Declaration. The pursuit of life and liberty and happiness are at America's core. And so much of what we talk about in our rights discourse today is so deeply disconnected and indeed undermines those central understandings of our nation. Our founders comprehended the horrific excesses that issued from the deification of emperors in places like Rome. Our founders understood that the wrath that the kings and queens of Europe unleashed when they believed themselves truly to be divine. Never idolize the state. This is the essence of Marxism. It's what General Secretary Xi Jinping wants you to do here in America. Our government is not God. We must not allow it to impose itself as an object of worship. Climate change shouldn't be worshiped either. The state's bounty is not created by any miracle, but it's seized only to be given out and offered to constituents to whom it has incurred debt. If state and church are conjoined, so are their dominions. This is not America. It's more like Iran, and now today, Afghanistan. Statists always, you know them, you see them. They're now occupying enormous positions of power. Statists pretend that it is heaven on earth. But such a prize never will be realized. If this affront is to be vanquished, each of us must insist that faith never be banished from the public square or from our schools. The second point is the left's domination of our institutions. You all see it every day. Some of you sent your kids here to this place to help teach them that this doesn't have to be. Our nation's present crisis have been inculcated by elites who posture beneficence as they practice rapaciousness. Woke billionaires ensconced on their super yachts, lecture us about climate change as they flaunt their own admonitions. Dante wrote, "A hypocrite's outward appearance passes for holiness, but under the show lies the terrible weight of this deceit." Such persons cannot be entrusted. They cannot be trusted, but they define the new ruling class here in America. I'm counting on you all to make sure this does not continue. It can't stand, for our country cannot withstand deceit, cloaked, feigned concern for the dispossessed. Our strengths in some ways have been turned against us. Hollywood and America's corporations were critical elements of our nation's soft power. I didn't benefit from that as Secretary of State. It involves global engagement and the sharing of goals to obtain national objectives. America's soft power once seemed completely invincible. But Hollywood, our media, press, and international businesses are no longer the forces that they were for democratic development and for market creation throughout the world. This has now changed fundamentally. Hollywood, completely infiltrated by China. This is not the first time that a malevolent foreign power has tried to influence our media. We all know the history in the 30s where Nazis endeavored to subject American films to censorship, not only in Germany but around the world. Their plans were in fact stymied by a counterintelligence network led by a patriot attorney named Leon Lewis, who was the first national secretary of the Anti-Defamation League. Today, these big Hollywood conglomerates dominate. They control American media, publishing, and news sources. You all are subjected to it day in and day out. Thus, access to Chinese markets creates substantial pressure for them to kowtow and obey Beijing's dictates. Xinjiang's Security Bureau and propaganda departments, a place and a leadership holding 1 million people in bondage today, where genocide is taking place. They were thanked by Disney in the closing credits of their film Mulan. Where, I ask, is this country's concern for Xinjiang's Muslims who are subject to this genocide? You should know this too. Wall Street, it's caved. There are over 250 Chinese companies listed on our exchanges here in the United States. They're capitalized by more than $21 trillion. Major U.S. companies are now owned or influenced by entities that front for the Chinese Communist Party. But an even greater threat is upon us, too. The world's largest asset managers are pouring into China today. Billions of your dollars in investment capital, from pension funds in California to Michigan to my home state of Kansas. This situation is so fraught with risk that George Soros now recommends that Congress pass legislation empowering the SEC to limit the flow of funds to China. That is the first time I've said a nice thing about him in my 57 years. Something about blind squirrels and acorns. President Trump and I, working with Congress, did our best. We designed a financial architecture to defend scores of millions of Americans who, without their knowledge, have had their savings invested in the Chinese Communist Party and Chinese companies. Beijing's fundraise is opaque. Its instruments are passive. They're in big assemblages of mutual funds, money that will flow to China and not to America. They finance the security apparatus, the security architecture in China, and they are erecting a powerful, powerful capability that threatens each of us. This summer, over $500 billion in Chinese stock value was lost, gutting American investors overseas because the CCP cracked down on its technology companies and its other businesses. They did that just for political power. But when our woke corporations vehemently disapprove of Georgia's actions to enforce basic election integrity, but are silent on China's rampage, we have to recognize that businesses, as well as Wall Street firms, have been bought or intimidated. Such feigned moral rectitude and certitude at home is a fig leaf for moral cowardice abroad. We can't allow this to continue to happen. We can fix it. We simply must find the will. Chinese companies that abet genocide, slave labor, and the construction of concentration camps cannot be underwritten by America's pension fund or American investors. We must not fund these Chinese corporations that advance manufacturing in China so that they can build weapons that will one day threaten your children and your grandchildren. And I do not intend to rest until the ruinous underwriting of a totalitarian police state is brought to an abrupt trial. This administration, not so much. But the American people get it. We must remove this financial dagger before it destroys us. Education or indoctrination in our schools is a decision that each of us will have to make. It's connected to the China challenge. The fight we must engage is sustained by a sound education. This was what I love about this place. To nullify what someone may become so that even they themselves do not know what God intended them to be is absolutely inhuman. I can't imagine what my life would have been like had I not had the privilege to attend the United States Military Academy. In my freshman year, I went to a place called Los Amigos High School. We were the Lobos, the friendly wolves, go figure. Had a professor, his name was Daryl Manderscheid. He taught me geometry and advanced algebra. He challenged me every day. He set the bar ever higher. And because of his support and care, I was able to explore logic and the beauty of mathematics. That foundation that he fostered was broad. I grew to understand that to learn, one must truly listen. To solve complex questions, one has to make sure that they have a rigorous analysis. This is obligatory. These ideas that Professor Manderscheid taught me are with me to this day. And I thank God that he blessed me with this. My wife Susan and I pray that our son Nick got the same kind of learning in his school. And we are proud parents of him because we think it mostly stuck. As I describe in smaller circles, he's a good kid most days. Knowledge around the world is absolutely exploding. But paradoxically, our capacity to assimilate and employ that knowledge wisely seems more limited than ever to me. I saw this in my time these last 4 years, and most especially in my time serving in Congress for 6 years. It's because we can't intelligibly speak or work faster than we can actually think, but the internet and social media demand that we do. Thoughtless responses are rife. I may have given one or two myself from time to time. We all recognize that school choice and not socialist policies and privatization must happen to reform our schools. Indeed, it is your 1776 curriculum that should be taught each place and everywhere. I get asked from time to time, where should I read to get my knowledge? And I say, a little more of the Constitution, a little less of the 1619 Project is a darn good start. We fled Washington, D.C. We got as far as Chantilly, Virginia. That's where we live today. That's in Loudoun County. I don't know if you've all seen it in the news. We know the critical race theory that has been taught in those places, parents are not going to have any of. It's glorious. We know it's neither critical nor a theory. It doesn't teach the critical thinking that's required for an unbiased explication of the complex issues that face us. The 1619 Project talks about America as systemically racist and a racist founding. We know that's not true. This creed itself has been condemned by scholars at Hillsdale and throughout the country, and yet you can't imagine how many places that is still central to what it is we're teaching the next generation. Look, a theory is an explanation for phenomenon that are widely accepted by a reputable scholarly community. Critical race theory was put forward as a political instrument, defined by its propagandic intent. And the prism of race through which the woke demand we see the world is a prism of limitations. It restricts us, and we can never accept it. We know this. We know that the New York Times stood behind the 1619 Project because for them, race is everything. Who believes this? We have too much common sense. We've made too much progress as a nation to return to a time when people were judged by the color of their skin. Critical race theory throws us back to that day. It's their sole intent. It wants to deface Martin Luther King's central and most monumental contributions to America. Fine, teach American slavery. Teach the history of our Constitution. But this is a noble nation founded on a central understanding that no nation has ever equaled. There is no place in any primary or secondary school, in any college or university, for students to be taught that race, color, religion, or economic status determine what they can potentially be or what they can achieve. We should never deny the terrible chapters in our nation's history, our mistreatment of indigenous nations and peoples, the internment of citizens of Japanese descent by President Roosevelt and his administration's turning away a ship whose Jewish passengers simply fled the Third Reich. But America's greatness, its uniqueness, is our ability to reflect upon that and learn and grow and advance against the steadfast principles that our founders bequeathed to us. We'll never allow our country to again segregate or deny freedom to any of its citizens. And any curriculum that categorizes school children by the color of their skin, as CRT does, or on the basis of their ancestry or of religion, is an obscenity. And obscenities don't belong in your children's classrooms. And America is not going to tolerate it. We must fight. China. I've alluded to it already. The United States and the People's Republic of China are fundamentally different because we honor the individual and they venerate the collective. Period, full stop. We now have a big decision to make. Theirs is a hive mind in which individualism is an illusion. This must never happen here in the United States. China's past deficit in power suppressed its ambitions. But this constraint has collapsed. The old notion of hide your time and bide your strength is gone from China today. Its attainment of wealth has propelled its quest to displace the United States as the world's leading power. The spread of the Wuhan virus, which China facilitated by spurring international flights from that city, while limiting internal travel, murdered millions of people. Our country's losses are 1.5 times the number of Americans killed in World War II. China's deployment of stealth aircraft today, the construction of its first supercarrier, and the expansion of its nuclear arsenal are threats to our homeland. And today, genocidal acts against Muslim minorities are a new imperialism. The Belt and Road Initiative, China's effort to commandeer the rest of the world, is in full push and match Xi Jinping's intentions and ambitions. Settle loan agreements with developing countries that seek to use national assets as collateral. I told leaders all around the world during my entire 4 years they are prepared to call the loan. China's theft of our intellectual property destroyed millions of jobs here in the United States. Cumulative losses exceed $2 trillion. That's just the last decade. This sum, if divided, could have made 1 in every 40 American families instant millionaires. It's staggering. China's business software, if you look at a laptop in China, is nearly all pirated from American businesses. The result is that software expenditures in China are a fraction compared to that here in the United States from American companies, conveying an enormous unearned competitive advantages to the Chinese firms. This must cease. But for 50 years, Republicans and Democrats alike in Washington just turned away, for after all, this was China. The Trump administration was the first to confront what will be the great challenge of the next 245 years for the United States of America. I have only partial answers to this, but we know that part of the answer lies in sanctions and countervailing cyber efforts, but such measures are inadequate. If American jobs and wealth are to be preserved, we're going to have to take serious action. We know how to do this in the United States. So here's the closing question. Xi Jinping has said many times to his Politburo that America is in decline. I don't believe it for a second. Indeed, I believe that decline is a choice. But will America muster the will to avert this disaster? History teaches yes, but great men had expectations for every American. The catastrophe that is Afghanistan is one of the greatest self-inflicted wounds that we've seen, at least in recent American history. It was caused by an administration who had a different understanding of American exceptionalism, whose words were simply not backed by deeds or by prudent policies derived from an understanding of America. A theocratic monstrosity has now declared itself victorious despite the irreplaceable loss of thousands of American lives, some of whom were my friends, and they killed citizens of our friends and allies as well. American military power is the guarantor of our promises. As America's most senior diplomat, I counted on the capacity for American force to back up the things that were in America's interest, and the military counted on me to make sure that we seldom had to deploy it. It remains a force. It remains a force without equal, but it must be properly understood. This strength can be destroyed by politicized military leaders who shun accountability and care more about appearances than the mission that the Constitution lays forth for them. Where are the generals and admirals who will tender their resignations before complying with politically motivated orders which have put our nation at real risk? In 1949, an admiral's revolt protested actions that could have crippled the United States Navy. Fleet Admiral Ernest King, Chester Nimitz, and Haley all left active service, consequential rank, testified before Congress against the Truman administration's plans. And the Korean War had proved them right. The Pentagon must not be composed of pinstripe diplomats. We have enough of those. It must not be construed of the woke. We have enough of those too. We need generals who understand their mission. I was criticized often, but I was criticized too for getting rid of some of these types at the State Department. My sadness was only that I could not have done more. Recouping from a failed strategy of nation building, the Trump administration was determined to reduce America's commitment in Afghanistan. You only need to read President Trump's Twitter account to know that. But we had the handle on this. We were prepared to do so in a way that reflected the greatness of America, would have kept our people safe, and we would have done so in an orderly and structured manner. For reasons that seemed to hinge on appearances, President Biden picked September 11th as a date certain for American departure. And rather than understanding the realities and all the planning that me and my team had overseen, they cast it aside. As Secretary of State, I worked to build upon the work I'd done as CIA director to aid President Trump in thinking concretely about how we would execute on his commitment to the American people, that we would get our young men and women home from that place and execute a withdrawal from Afghanistan while preserving the hard-won progress that we had achieved there. What we'd established was the certainty of action if the Taliban didn't do what we told them they must do. You all have seen, how many of you seen the picture of me standing there with Mullah Baradar? Yes, New York Times likes to make it famous. Mullah Baradar understood Donald Trump and Mike Pompeo. He knew that if they violated the understandings that they had reached with us, that we would deploy overwhelming force to inflict unbearable costs upon them, real losses, leaving the extremists in terrible situation. I made them know in the meetings with them and by phone, as did President Trump, that if they failed to live up to the promises they made, that just like General Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian leader who killed so many Americans, they too would never kill another American. That we understood how to use American power in a way that reduced the frequency with which we would have to do so. That the demise of the Quds Force leader, the strike that we took, resounded to the Taliban's consciousness. This administration threw it all away. I'd created a group. We'd seen what happened. I was a young congressman. I served on the Benghazi committee. I'd seen what happened when the State Department abandoned its diplomats abroad, and I had worked diligently for my entire time to build what we called the Contingency Crisis and Response Bureau. It was designed to help in crises where there were American diplomats in harm's way. In June of 2021, this administration disbanded that very organization. What the Biden administration never recognized is that our multiple agreements concerning America's conditional departure from Afghanistan were made possible by our administration's vow to use that overwhelming force. Our attainment of energy independence and our decisive action in destroying the ISIS caliphate illustrated to all in the world our resolve. When we moved our embassy to Jerusalem, President Trump made clear that we would continue to honor the commitments that he had made, and the Taliban knew this. By removing the ISIS terrorist threat and by changing the status of Jerusalem, we eliminated obstacles to progress. The Abraham Accords, a truly historic set of understandings made possible by great leaders like Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Crown Prince in the Emirates, they were made possible because of American leadership. Our tenacity caused those 4 Muslim countries to have confidence that they could make peace with the Jewish state. If we'd have had a second term, there'd be more. I can't prove it, but I know it in my heart. Together, we would have erected prodigious barriers to terrorism. These triumphs, these things about which I played a small part and for which I am intensely proud, were disregarded by this administration because acknowledging our breakthroughs was deemed by the Biden administration as a far greater sin than abandonment of our allies or our principles. Afghanistan today is lost, its progress nullified, its women dehumanized. It is incomprehensible that we departed from Bagram Air Base while the Taliban attacked. This fortified airfield would have been the only possibility to get every American out. It was protected. It was an avenue for egress and evacuation so that we would not leave any American behind. And then we surrendered billions of dollars in equipment. They valued above and beyond by the terrorists and by the Chinese and the Russian engineers who, at this very moment, are likely duplicating our peerless technologies. This Taliban effort may think they have won a miraculous victory, but I'm confident that America remains strong. If America is to be harmed, it will only be through our own folly. One day, we will restore and reclaim American greatness. I pray that it is soon. We have to make sure that our enemies understand that we will strike you without pity if you murder innocents, threaten American interests. We'll strike you. We will know that this is through American honor, just as our founders had articulated. I and you came out on this night. You all say no to decline. America's path, our future is in our own hands. We must not choose defeat, neglect, or shame. I went to Cairo to give that speech for the singular purpose. It was a little bit personal to me. President Obama had stood in that place and conducted what has become known as his apology tour. I wanted to go stand in the exact same place. He spoke at Al-Azhar University, and so I was set and determined to go there. About 2 weeks out, my team came in, including my security team, and said, "Sir, you're not going to be able to speak at Al-Azhar University." And I said, "Why?" He said, "We're not sure that we can protect you adequately." And I said, "The President of the United States spoke from there." And they said, yes, they liked him. Look, I grew up in California and spent a lot of my summers in America's heartland in Kansas. Dr. Arnn was talking about all my cousins in Kansas. Everybody thought that'd be a big political advantage, but I know those cousins. If I got half of their votes, I am lucky. I have been at the Thanksgiving dinner table with them. Neither of my parents had the chance to graduate from college. My mother was a clerk. She was employed by the Boeing Company in Wichita, Kansas, as part of the war effort in the late 1940s. My father grew up in New Mexico. He's a salesman. He served a short stint in the United States Navy in the Korean War. But they taught me something in the same way I'm confident you taught your kids something. They taught me to respect the importance of hard work. So did rising before dawn to help my uncle Jim on our farm in Winfield, Kansas. I remember being there at 10 years old. I thought I was working. I am confident I was more trouble than I was worth. But by the time I was 14, I was driving trucks and doing my best to lift a bale of hay. I knew what it meant to work hard. I cherished, too, my after-school job in Costa Mesa, California. For it paid for my first car, a really old Fiat X19. I was a killer good scooper at Baskin-Robbins. Our purported masters in Washington will soon have added $10 trillion to the national debt. Think about that. $1 trillion is a ridiculous amount of money. Stacks and stacks. In each and every stack, $1 million. $10 trillion is more than $30,000 for each and every one of you. For a family of four, that's $120K in new debt that may happen yet this week. Would anyone here trust Speaker Pelosi to mortgage your family's future? I didn't hear a yes. No need for a second on the motion. Look, we're going to get this right. I'm deeply committed to it. There is an awakening taking place. There's a reclamation. Thanks to the geniuses running our government today, we're seeing significant inflation too. Without wealth creation or substantial growth, this will hurt everybody in the middle class. By putting government in charge, these leaders have performed their miracle of making the stupendous vanish. We can do much better, and I'm confident that we will. But we have to choose this, and I believe that we will. The Taliban think they've got their moment. I know differently. You know differently. Free will and its exercise are deeply embedded in our Constitution. My time in service these 4 years in administration that was prepared to defend the important things, the hard things, the things that matter to hardworking men and women all across America, was cut abruptly short. As I have traveled these last now 8 months, been to a couple of dozen states, and I listen, I'm very confident the choice that the American people are going to make. Don't let Xi Jinping fool you. We are not in decline. Our Declaration of Independence has made a resilient people, and our Constitution has provided a framework by which those resilient people will continue to rise. I spent 4 years reading the intelligence reports as CIA director and then working on some of the toughest problems that the world faces. There were pretty dark days and pretty dark moments, and so I tend, when I'm in front of groups, to speak about these dark times, these difficult challenges. They're real. We must confront them. but I'm long on America. I believe deeply that we will reclaim our sovereignty and our borders, that we will reclaim these central institutions, that we will push back against the Chinese Communist Party, and that this nation will not choose to allow the next 245 years to deny the very opportunities that permitted each of us to be here tonight, to be what our children and grandchildren are living in. Thank you for supporting this important institution. Thank you all for coming out tonight, and I am happy to answer just about any question. Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all. All right, bring it.
Hello.
Yes, I'm sorry, where are you?
Over here.
Got you. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, on the left, believe it or not. So anyways, thank you for your speech tonight, and I appreciate it. And you're one of my favorite people who are leaders today, and I always feel like when I hear you speak, I'm like hearing the grown-up speak. I do appreciate that.
I tried to use my grown-up words tonight. Yes.
So, boy, what I wanted to ask is, so when Trump enacted Executive Order 13484, I believe, on September 12th of 2018, and it was sanctions in the case of foreign interference in our elections, and that would protect us from what happened in our election. So from your speech here tonight, are you saying that there was no foreign interference in our elections in 2020?
Yeah. So you remember I said I'd answer almost anything? No, I want to be a little careful here because some of the knowledge that I have here is knowledge that continues to be classified, but I think I can answer your question in large measure, completely and fully. We've had foreigners trying to interfere in our election for a long time in the United States. The left went after the election of 2016 and then ultimately did so in a way that tried to undermine the United States of America by somehow suggesting that Russian interference had an impact on the outcome. You'll know how many Democrats called President Trump a Russian asset. Look, we know this was a hoax from the beginning. It was false. It wasn't true. And yet it took a little bit away from America's confidence in our election system. So when I think about foreigners interfering in our election, I know that we do a pretty good job in protecting them from attacking our vote tallies and vote counts. But the real way that they attack our elections is through propaganda and information warfare. And you should know they are enabled by large parts of the United States media as well, who facilitated this very storyline for the first 2 years of our administration. Right? It wasn't just Adam Schiff. It was also Brian Stelter, right? Aided and abetted in the most serious way. We watched what state legislatures did during this last election, often under the disguise of, well, we have to do this because of the Wuhan virus, right? We can't go out, we can't vote. Everybody just toss a ballot in the mail. Each of us has a responsibility to look forward and make sure that we never have another election that we don't have confidence in. It's an absolute imperative. As a Secretary of State, you all can appreciate this. As a Secretary of State, we evaluated elections all across the world. Almost every week, there'd be an election somewhere, and I would get a memo saying, country X had a crappy election. Or country Y had a good, free, and fair election. And we would often, much like when I was a high school basketball player, would give out most improved player awards. Like it was a bad election, it was better than their last one. We have to have one that's better than our last one. And I don't mean in 2024, I mean in 2022. That requires a lot of effort. It requires you holding accountable your state elected officials who, in my judgment, many times Republican state elected officials did not do the fundamental thing which they were required to do. They had the authority to do it well, and they were pushed off of that target set. I'll leave to voters to determine why they made that set of decisions. We have to have a set of elections that are determinative. And I guess the last thing I'd say here is, we know how to do this. This is not particularly complex or hard. Let's start by making sure there's someone attesting to their identification when they cast their ballot. There are building blocks. There are building blocks to save safe elections that we must put in place. Yes, sir. All right. I'm sorry. Thank you. I'm going to try and get to someone else if that's okay. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Secretary Pompeo, thank
Yes.
you so much for coming here tonight. My name is Josiah Lippincott. I'm a PhD student here. You spoke tonight about totalitarian regimes. Over the past year, we've seen these lockdowns. We've seen mandates throughout the West, an increasing large amount of biomedical security. It seems that these democratic regimes, like Australia, and then even here, have become increasingly repressive of our basic rights and liberties, including the right to travel. And it seems our government is increasingly unaccountable. There was a shocking story that came out just recently that there was a faction in the CIA, for instance, that intended to or planned to assassinate Julian Assange. So it seems like we have an increasing tendency toward unaccountability in our government. I just wondered if you could speak to that here in the West.
Let me just answer that last one because someone's going to go Google that. My name is on it. They assert that was me that was trying to kill Julian. So you should know, don't believe Michael Isikoff, okay? So don't believe everything you read in Yahoo News is a good start. Your core point, though, about about the administrative state and the closure of America and the denial of liberty is fundamentally true. I would say this, I don't think this is a particularly new phenomenon. This didn't just start. At least since the 1960s, the left has had an active effort to reduce the space for freedom and ideas and for liberty. By controlling the media that I spoke about, there are lots of tools that have been used. I will say that this Wuhan virus lowered the water level, so we saw a lot more rocks. I think the rocks were there before the virus. We also saw, and this is maybe how I'll finish the answer to this question, we also saw how few Americans were willing to push back against this. I can't tell you, I'll say this differently. I had a handful of pastors call me when they were being told that they couldn't worship in their space in a way that they deemed safe. I was proud that those pastors ultimately said, I'm going to do it. And there is a long history of civil disobedience in the United States of America. I'm not suggesting that it is not complex, but I can say this. If we don't hold accountable leaders, and I don't just mean when we think of leaders, we think of presidents, we think of state U.S. senators. How about your sheriff's office? How about your school board? How about your city council? These people impact our lives. We saw city councils issue these crazy things. Hardy Americans must push back against this. We have to go retake. I learned a lot. I know more about how to do this now than I did 4 years ago. Maybe everybody's a little naive until they get kicked in the head. This is a fight worth having about freedom and making sure making sure we are not to wear this. This is not the CCP here in the United States today. But we started from such a face that's so fundamentally different that the risk that it falls here quickly is real. And so time is upon us. So thanks for that question. It's an important one. Yes?
Thank you again for coming tonight.
You bet.
I'm going to just tell you my background real quick. For the last 4 decades plus, I spent my career in healthcare. Started in pharmacy school, then medical school, then trained at the Cleveland Clinic in neurosurgery, and then practiced for over 20 years in solo practice in Columbus, Indiana. Then retired about 7.5 years ago. So what I'm about to share with you, I share with a heavy heart, and I want everyone to understand that they should really think about this. I wrote it down so it could be as brief as possible. The hospital and healthcare system has been captured by a corrupt bureaucracy and corporatist control that is nothing less than fascism. Public-private partnerships like the FDA, NIH, CDC are putting out guidelines that state health departments, hospitals, and conventional medical practices owned by larger institutions are blindly following. The PrEP Act immunized them from medical legal liability. The needs of the individual patient no longer are a priority, and this is an utter betrayal of a most solemn obligation between a doctor and a patient and the institutions where these doctors work. Nations like India are more open to giving the public access to a full spectrum of early treatment options that are now being demonized and outlawed in Western nations by the mass media and bureaucratic cronies. Follow the money, sure, but also follow the ideology. A continuously sick American population, health-weakened American military are as great a threat to our nation's survival as any diabolical schemes of the CCP and the global collectivists. Certainly weakening and discrediting our health system is a big part of their plans. The public must seek out the truth in science for themselves. So my question to you is, I know you've had a front row seat to this issue as well, and people need to start getting better control of their health care. So what solutions or options would you suggest at this point?
Yeah. Well, I'm unlikely in the time allotted to be able to solve America's healthcare problems tonight. But I do have three thoughts. I worked on this a little bit when I was in Congress, but three thoughts. First, you got to the politicization. It's absolutely true. Certainly saw it in the pandemic response in our administration as well. I was working on the external piece of this, but Vice President and his task force were working on the domestic one. Make no mistake about it, senior American officials were not doing science, they were doing politics. Career people. Second, you lived it more up close and personal. My experiences with the medical system are mostly just me going in to see Doc. I still think it's the case, in spite of all the shortcomings you identified, that most people, if given a choice, would choose our system over anybody else's. You talked about India and outliers. Fair enough. I think most parents, given the choice, if they said, do you want to go through the NIH system in Britain or through a system in another country, I think our system's still the best. We certainly deliver, just as we did with Warp Speed. It didn't surprise me that it was the United States that drove that outcome, right? We got a cure, or at least a vaccine. The Chinese brought us a virus. Last thing is, anything that you centralize, in the way that we have centralized our healthcare system, will have enormous bureaucratic mismanagement and is subject to politicization. So if you said, Mike, what's the one core idea of how you try and unpack this entire labyrinth of our healthcare system, it would be to devolve as much decision-making as you can to different places, starting, frankly, with our 50 little laboratories, the states. Yes, sir.
Who are the champions of religious liberty in this country who you respect the most?
You know, President Trump gave me a lot of room to go work on religious liberty. We prioritize this in a way that no other administration has, and it didn't take 20 minutes for the Biden administration to knock the entire edifice of religious liberty down. Not one. You got some great leaders that are serving in the United States Senate, United States Congress, who care deeply about religious liberty. You have big bureaucracies. I spoke about this at some length. You have big bureaucracies that want to do everything they can to tear it down every place they find it. So I'll take a question from over here now. Yes, sir.
Hi, Secretary Pompeo.
Hi.
Thank you for being here. I wanted to ask a little bit about our allies in the world and like the way we've treated them in the past couple of years with this new administration. After we left Afghanistan, China's been pushing on those borders because they want those rare earth minerals, and they've been really flexing because we kind of lost our hold there, and Russia's kind of seeing that as a threat, and so they're trying to move in. Do you think that we still have enough standing there that if China or Russia makes a big push, we can deter them?
Oh, the answer is yes. The question is if we have the capability. The question is, do we have the will and the intent to do so? No, there's no doubt about the fact that we still have the capability. I heard from leaders all across the world after Afghanistan, and the question was a little bit about Afghanistan. It was a little bit about the withdrawal, but it was a lot about America's credibility. It was about the commitments and promises that we had made. Look, I get it. I will never forget the speech that I gave in Brussels. I was there talking about America first, and I was demanding that the European countries pick up more of their fair share. I was in a room about this size with about this many people. These would have been Brussels bureaucrats from the EU. I walked out of that room in dead silence. Even my team that's around me didn't even go, hey, that was really good, Mr. Secretary. Right? It was really good, actually. We were right. We do have the moral standing in the world to do this, but we have to deliver against that here at home, and then we have to demand it from our allies and friends around the world, and then we have to make sure we don't make promises we are not prepared to live up to. We were very clear about this. Everywhere I went, we talked about putting America at the top. Right, my duty. I raised my hand 7 times to swear allegiance to the Constitution. 7 times. Every time it talked about the same people that I was tasked to work on behalf of. It was the American people. We were clear about that. We were pilloried in the left press and the international press, right, for this idea that America was special and exceptional. We wanted to defend it. I knew if we did that and did that well and did it right, every leader in the world would want to see me because we'd make their country a happier, more prosperous, successful place too. And so we worked on it. By the way, no matter how bad a diplomat I was, I never had the French ambassador withdrawn on my watch. But just for the record. We have friends and allies because America is a force for good in the world. We have to be sure that we use that skill set, that talent set, our capabilities in a way that is, the founders talked about a restraint, right? There was this tension about international engagement. I think we struck the balance in a way that made sure we preserved the things that mattered to America, the interests that we had that were important, while still reflecting a force for good wherever we went in the world. Anyway, I hope that answers your question, at least in part. Yeah.
We have time for one more question.
All right, very good. Yes.
Mr. Secretary,
yes, sir.
Thank you for your dedication to duty, both militarily and the highest levels of the echelons of this country, and as the director of CIA and also as Secretary of State. So I personally appreciate it, and I think you're a great person in which our upcoming kids can look up to.
Thank you. That's very kind.
I have 2 questions, fairly simple, but maybe not. Depends how you want to address them. One is in your tenure as CIA director and also your tenure as Secretary of State. From your experience in those 2 positions, can you address briefly the deep state that might exist in our hierarchy within the government, our higher level bureaucracies today, in almost all of the secretary levels, not just the state and CIA? And also, lastly, perhaps you can briefly address what you perceive or what you might recommend is where you see President Trump might play a role in this government's presidency or elected officials over the next year and also in 2024.
Sure. No, I'm happy to take a swing at the first one. The second one's trickier. But you know, but game on, you know? So deep state, from my perspective, doesn't capture the magnitude of the problem. So yes, it exists. By the way, different at the 2 institutions I led, very different institutions. I saw different institutions too. The Department of Education, Civil Rights Division, the Justice Department, lost. What do I mean lost? They are no longer responsive to the political leadership that exists in those places. I certainly can't tell you how many times I had to pass the memo back 6 times at the State Department to get them to acknowledge that I was in charge. Right, and it's not about ego. I had the duty. The responsibility came with the authority. If it went badly, they weren't going to blame them. It's a real challenge. I have lots of theories about how to make it much better because it's imperative. The administrative state has to respond to what you all do. The first question was about elections. Right, we're talking about making sure we have a fair election. The elections mattered less if the administration just goes on its way, no matter who the president is. I wanted to make sure that the State Department was as responsive to me as it was to Hillary Clinton. Right? No, I mean, I wanted to make sure, right? If it's President Obama, the State Department should do the things that President Obama asked them to do. This is what our founders talked about. There weren't 4 branches, 6 branches, 9 branches. State Department thought it had 37. This is a serious matter that has to be undertaken. There are 3 unions at the State Department. I mean, we didn't get our political people confirmed fast enough either. It's that political control that allows you to drive effectively the operations that President Trump was asking me to go deliver on. Right? He set the policy. He's the one that sent me to Pyongyang to meet with Chairman Kim. Right? He's the one that sent me to Doha to meet with the Taliban. He's the one who said, I want you to go to Sochi and talk to Vladimir Putin. If the entity is not driving towards those very same objectives, you have a deeply unconstitutional and, frankly, a very, very challenging situation. And we probably suffered it as much as any administration. We were pretty unique in the way we approached the world. And we were different than previous Republican administrations as well. I viewed that as a feature, not a bug. But it made that task even more difficult and the challenge of the administrative state even more readily apparent. Second question. These are questions about 2022 and 2024 and President Trump's role in there. President Trump was a leader who the American people wanted. A significant number of the things that I talked about there wouldn't have happened with anyone else who was running in that field at that time. I'm convinced of it. He gave me a ton of space to go execute on his vision as well. And now, conservatives, I've been in the movement for a long time, lots of different roles, from fifth grade Sunday school teacher to, working on pro-life efforts and school choice efforts back in Kansas. Those of us who believe in these things all have to figure this out. People will start voting in the 2022 elections less than 12 months from now. It seems like a long ways off, like we just got through this last election. It's upon us. And President Trump can be an incredibly important part of doing that. The first time I ran for office was in 2010. Came in with 70-something Republicans in the House of Representatives, the big class, the so-called Tea Party class. It was the last time we threw Nancy Pelosi out. Who would dream I'd be campaigning trying to do it again? I pray that President Trump will continue to be a really important part of that. What happens after that? President Trump will have to make his own set of decisions, right? He'll have to figure out if this is the right place and the right call for him, as will each person who decides to put themselves forward and offer their services to America, both the folks who are running in 2022 and those who choose to run for president in 2024 as well. Anyway, I hope that answers your question, at least in part. Yeah. All right,
Please join me in
got one more, or
thanking-
does everybody else need to leave?
Please join me in thanking Mr.
Oh,
Pompeo.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thanks, everybody. Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Bless you. Thank you. Talk to my wife. We'll see y'all.
Okay, thank you, Secretary Pompeo, and thanks to all of you for joining us this evening. We're adjourned. Thank you very much.